But first to South Australia and a horror story about crop farmers battling a slimy pestilence. Imagine what damage millions of snails can do to a crop. When mashed up in the headers, these pests are said to resemble a mixture of superglue and snot. And a couple of wet autumns has meant the problem is now worse than ever.
This is the worst year we've experienced with harvest.
As a person from the land, it's devastating. It's like any other plague, whether it's mice or locusts or in this case, snails.
Crushed snail is a recipe for cement, basically. Makes a hell of a mess of the crop.
We all look for the silver bullet answer, you know, something we can put in a can and put in a spray unit and go and apply to the paddock and the solution's, the problem solved. I don't think it's that easy.
They hail from the Mediterranean, probably arriving accidentally in ship ballast. But they've made themselves very much at home in the Australian grain belt.
All my life there's been snails on the property, but it wasn't until 1998 when we had a significant problem where we had grain like rejected at the silo, and that's usually when most people sit up and take notice that they've got a problem.
No one has a bigger snail problem than Graham Hayes.
Here's a stump. I guess we'll be able to find something under here. I'll just have a look and see. Oh yeah, there we are.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
All little small conicals.
He farms at Waruka on the southern York Peninsula in South Australia. It's good grain country, reliable rainfall, temperate, surrounded by seawater. It's sheltered from the dreadful heat of the inland, as well as the frost. Trouble is, these conditions also favour snails, and this dogged and determined farmer has been waging a war against them most of his working life.
This is the pre-harvest count, and in this 1/10 of a square metre there are 600 snails. You can see them clustering at the base of the barley plants.
The snails climb fence posts and even trees to get off the hot ground.
She oak tree out in the middle of the paddock, cropping paddock, and how on earth would you deal with them, save bulldozing the tree? And this
but where they cause the most trouble is in the crops, where they clog up harvesters and contaminate grain deliveries.
Once it's allowed to dry, it's like cement, actually. It sets out hard and it's very difficult to clean off once it's allowed to dry. But, I mean, I know many years ago in the 50s, people were talking about their harvesters leave them overnight and they were being fly blown overnight, and that was a mess to clean out.
To demonstrate the scale of the problem, Mr Hayes has hauled these samples of snail-infested grain to meetings all over the country, telling anyone who'll listen that the pests are costing farmers hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. This was meant to be a 3 tonne to the hectare lentil crop, but despite baiting 3 times last year, Graham Hayes didn't harvest a thing. The snails took over. 170 hectares had to be abandoned.
We spent $48,000 last year on 30 tonne of bait, and some crops we baited 3 times and were a write-off. So that was just like, you know, in the end result, had we known all that, we would have been better off just to kept our seed in the shed and looked for a job somewhere.
The laying out of metaldehyde baits is a regular practice on this property, but it's definitely not the only method of attack. After harvest on a very hot day, Graham Hayes runs a giant cable across the stubble, flicking the snails off the stalks and onto the ground, where they use up their moisture and die. He also brings out the steel rollers, crushing the snails and again flicking them into the hot dirt. Meanwhile, the harvested crop goes through a complicated and time-consuming screening and cleaning process. He calls this the miracle machine. At 40 tonnes an hour, grain is run between heavy polypropylene-coated steel rollers.
It just crushes the snail without damaging the grain, providing it is adjusted correctly.
And with the receival depots allowing just one snail per 200 grams of grain, this inventive farmer has also rigged up a series of augers and filters that screen and scalp. So life revolves around trying to deal with snails.
It is. It's 100% of our year is like, you know, working how we can deal with them.
For as many years as Graham Hayes has been dealing with snails on farm, Jeff Baker has been looking at them down a microscope.
These are what we call white or round or globular snails. There are some others which are more conical, turret-shaped. They come from the Mediterranean in Europe. They've been in Australia about 100 years, and they are major problems for the grains industry across southern Australia.
The CSIRO entomologist says there are 4 species of problematic snails, and they are prolific breeders. Being hermaphrodites, every snail produces juveniles, about 400 each per year. While they're in plague proportions on South Australia's Yorke Peninsula, they're also causing grief around Mount Gambier, Geraldton in Western Australia, as well as parts of Western Victoria and southern New South Wales. And alarmingly, they're on the radar of our international grain trading partners.
The one snail that I'm looking at here at the moment is on the top 100 potentially invasive species that the quarantine authorities in the United States are watching out for. It has the potential to be quite a cooling point for our grain quality reputation.
If our cargoes get overseas and we've got to certify there are no snails there, none, it's going to be very, very hard to give that documentation to them. Very hard indeed. Because even in this farm, there is the odd snail that gets through.
The Mediterranean...
Neil Smith's concern about the burgeoning snail problem first made news almost 20 years ago.
Neil Smith is one of the many casualties trying to sort snails from a bean harvest.
Also based on Yorke Peninsula, Neil Smith regularly rolls his paddocks. This property is about an hour north of Graham Hayes, where the weather is a little hotter and the snails not quite so severe.
We look with horror at some of the snail populations I've got down there, and that probably makes us extra vigilant here in using the various techniques we've got to keep their numbers down.
It's believed one reason snails are getting a foothold across the grain-growing regions is because no-till farming, where stubble is retained, provides a lovely, cosy environment for the molluscs to flourish. So Neil Smith has bucked the no-till trend.
We've decided to stay away from no-till simply because of snails and mice.
And he's also decided to crop only 65% of his property. The rest is pasture, carrying sheep.
They are able to knock the snails off, and the snails being knocked off, whether it's pasture or whether it's crop, them trying to get back up is one way of killing them because you actually exhaust their moisture supply. So sheep play a very, very important part of the system simply because it's the alternative enterprise in the farm to continuous cropping 100%.
He keeps the fence lines clear too, reducing snail habitat. And like many growers in this part of the world, he'll also burn some stubble. Fire is fairly effective, although, as these black paddocks show, a lot of the small conical snails survive the flames. It's these smaller molluscs that Jeff Baker tried to tackle back in the 1990s.
There are several flies that attack the snails in Europe, and our challenge is to find the most appropriate ones that will kill the snails and kill only those snails.
After spending 8 years in quarantine, a snail-attacking fly was unleashed on Australian trial sites in 2000, including on Graham Hayes' farm.
The fly was released here and in about May, and it sort of stayed with the snails until October when the new flies emerged. And so it was sort of encouraging that would maybe a way we eventually might be able to control the snails, but it hasn't been as successful as was hoped.
More than a decade later, that fly program is about to be revisited, with Dr. Baker going back to the CSIRO base in France to see if he can find a more suitable parasite.
When we did the original work in Europe, the molecular tools that are now available to trace the origins of things, whether they be your human ancestors or the biocontrol agents that work against snails, they didn't exist. They do now.
What you're seeing is another promising snail killer, a naturally occurring Australian nematode that burrows through the snail's gut and literally poisons its blood.
Nematodes are like small eels and they live in the soil, and there's a whole range of different ones. There are some that attack plants, some that eat bacteria, and the ones that we have here attack snails, and so they're fairly selective against snails and insects.
In 2010, Gavin Ash's team from Charles Sturt University placed snails in cages and spread out the nematodes in varying quantities and on different species.
We grow bacteria on the agar because they will grow in these artificial conditions. And then we take our nematodes and seed them onto here. The nematodes then grow and feed on the bacteria, and we get a very thick soup of bacteria and nematodes that we can use to apply in the field.
The early results weren't as good as the researchers had hoped for, so they tweaked the trial methodology and tried again in spring last year with more success. They now have a commercial partner producing the nematodes and the possibility of a marketable solution in the next couple of years.
We're very excited about the nematode program, Prue. The researchers are getting a lot closer to identifying the specific types of nematodes that will do the job on the snails, so further research is needed. But then there's some challenges ahead with that program. It's not a chemical, this is a live nematode that we've got to apply to the paddock, so we have to work out ways in which that can occur.
You're still looking out for these
Bunches of snails.
bunches of snails that have been baited. Bill Long is involved in the snail program on a number of levels.
Here we are. Here's a good example of how well the bait's working.
He's on the GRDC's Southern Panel, is an agronomic consultant and also a farmer with his own snail problem. To what extent is it on the radar of GRDC?
It's very much on the radar at the moment. The issue has been discussed at many of the panel meetings recently, so we're across the fact that it's an emerging issue and that growers are very much concerned about it.
But Graham Hayes is critical of the lack of recent attention directed towards snail control.
It is a major issue, and it's disappointing that the funding on research stopped in 2005, and we hope that significant funds could be put towards the way we can achieve a 100% result.
Certainly after a number of drought years and low interest in snails and now a couple of damp autumns and the resurgence of snails, it will go to the top of the priority list, I'm sure, with many growers, and therefore we'll start to try and get some more projects on the ground.
In charge of new farm products at the GRDC, Paul Maybush says snails and slugs are back on the agenda. With the corporation's funding, through grain grower levies, A new round of nematode trials is about to be rolled out. Another wet start to autumn means snails would now be multiplying. Sadly, for a handful of grain growers on the lower Yorke Peninsula, any solution to this plague will come too late.
There was thousands of acres of property down here that is for sale now, currently, has been for 2 or 3 years, some of it. I've been around long enough to know a significant reason is that because of the snails, they can't produce enough off that land without a huge cost, and so it's all too hard.
And have you ever thought of walking away from it, saying it's all too hard as well?
No, not really. I mean, it's a challenge, there's no doubt about that. And I guess I'm just, well, you know, determined to do everything we possibly can, and I just hope that in my lifetime I can see an end where we can, you know, at least farm without having to worry, you know, first of all, what can we do, how can we do with the snails? So no, we're not going to walk away.
Prue Adams with that report.